Now, we're going to start off with a semi-scientific experiment because we keep rabbiting on about not seeing things, access, and so on. And so let's try and establish how much of a yacht, we'll take a yacht, simple. How much of a yacht do we really see? So I'm going to work down 90%, 75%, so on. Let me give you the background. 36-foot sloop built by typical continental, maybe a French firm, 11 meters long, sloop rig, inboard engine. Mast is up. So the first thing we agree is you haven't seen the mast above head height. And of course, she's lined, maybe not the anchor locker, maybe not the cockpit lockers, but she's lined solid. So you can't see any of the structure from the forward end of the forward cabin to the back of the aft cabin. Now, who thinks at the end of the day you have seen 90% of the structure? Well, that's nice. 75%. That's even better. 60%. 50%. 40%. 25%. You see the point. We are not doing totally comprehensive surveys. Very occasionally, I survey, I'm a founder member of the Ocean Cruising Club, and very occasionally I survey boats which are going around the world. I insist on taking the rudder off, and the engine out, and the tanks out. I'd be very interested if anybody has ever told an owner to do that. I tell, God bless you, yes. Yeah.
I recommend it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm not saying I'm the best surveyor, but I started in the middle of the Second World War, 75 years ago. And I've written 28 books. And to give you an idea, that green book, there's a chapter on anchors. I wrote to the British Library, Euston Road, London, gave them 3 weeks, and I said, I'm turning up in 3 weeks' time, and I want books on anchors and PhDs on anchors. And when I got there was a 3-level trolley, and they were packed. There were 26 books on anchors, and God knows how many things. What I'm saying is that none of us have more than one person's life experience until we get in. I'm calling my own tune, I know. The books are very cheap. I one time aimed to buy and read 12 technical books every year. Now, nobody's writing the bloody things except me, because everybody's discovered you can't make any money out of them. But I do think people should try and keep up technically. And I don't trust the internet as far as I can throw it. And I'm with BT. And so I doubly don't trust it. What I've done, I've gone through a few pictures. Now, can we have the first one? Can you see that at the back? These are no particular order because I had to rush this, nobody's fault. Seized bow rollers, why would that matter? Well, the answer is, of course, everybody now wants an electric windlass. If the electric windlass is put on when the vessel is new, it's the cheapest, smallest the builder can get. So it's not really adequate. If the owner puts one on an older boat, he goes for the appropriate manufacturer size, and they're worried about costs, so they underspecify. If anybody comes to us and says they want to put an electric windlass on, we look at the charts of 36-footer Mark III, and we say, no, go to the one for the 40-footer. So bow rollers, which don't roll, I think, matter. Now, that's a tiny thing, but that is my attitude towards surveying. Because we don't see everything, what we should do is pile in as much information as we can. And my surveys would run to 120 pages if I did what a lot of other people do and describe the boat. All I do is list the defects. Okay, page 1, there's all the conditions and what I'm not going to see and so on. But the vast majority of my reports are defects, and some of them are tiny. Sharp edges to the side ears, that's the side plates. The very best boats in the world have sharp edges. Sometimes the bow plates are turned outwards at the forward end, but they still leave sharp edges. And I've known a boat come ashore overnight because she was pitching gently. The warp was stretching, rubbing up and down the sharp edges. These are tiny things, but they really do matter. Leaks at chain plates. I have a great enthusiasm for plastic cards because they're so useful for sliding under the deck plate. If you can get a plastic card under a deck plate, then the water can get there. And you get leaks. And we'll come to that in a minute. But it's such a simple test. When I look down at a deck plate, I like to see a bead of bedding, which has not got hard, right round each deck plate. Cracks at the mast base. You get cracks in the cabin top, you get cracks in the spar, you get cracks in the step casting. When I was apprentice, we had a rule, I don't know where it came from, that the tension on the shrouds would be up to twice the displacement of the boat. And that being so, the down compression at the mast will be at least twice the displacement of the boat. It's quite a useful rule of thumb. And when you think about punching into a head sea somewhere down off the Mullican Tyre with the wind against tide, I would have thought that's possibly an inadequate estimate of the total loads you get there. I don't know when I reckoned to be able to tell when a winches needed servicing. Certainly I couldn't do it for 20 years, and I'm never quite sure now. Although a great trick is, of course, to run the barrel through 360 degrees and see if one of the pawls is not dropping in place. And if there's one pawl not dropping in place, then you can be damn sure the winches have not been serviced. And if you look at the deck of the boat and she has an aura of neglect, then I think it's a damn good idea to say the winches need servicing. No deviation card for the compass. I was sailing down the Clyde a few years ago on my own, and the fog came right down and you could just see the bow from the cockpit. And I was embarrassed to see that the steering compass was 7 degrees different to the autohelm compass. So that was a boat which got maintained every weekend from October till the end of March, and it still didn't have a deviation card. So I would lay a very substantial bet for the next 10 boats you see, you won't see more than one deviation card, and it could matter. Right, can we go on to the next picture? Now, we have this problem of what matters and what does not matter. And I have suggested here things which will sink a boat. The Hans factory uses aluminium alloy rudder stocks. Johnson designs J109s and J44s. They have aluminium rudder stocks. I've written a book called Small Steel Craft, and it's got a chapter on aluminium. And the essence of the chapter is aluminium corrodes while you watch it. It corrodes morning, noon, and night. It corrodes on every condition. And it's great for aeroplanes because they accept a few crashes. And the inspection levels on aeroplanes is really very strict indeed. Nobody ever sees the rudder stock. I asked for a rudder stock to be taken, a rudder to be dropped the other day, and the broker threw his hands up in her and said, bloody Nicholson, as usual, over the top. The owner was a bit disconcerted until I said, how many children have you got? And that brought his feet back onto the ground, and we duly took the rudder down, and it had some troubles. A few years ago, I surveyed a Contessa 38, and everybody told me what a superb boat it was, how brilliant it was built. Naturally, the broker rabbited on as usual about it, but the buyer and the seller told me that I was going to have a very easy job surveying this boat. he had kids too, and he was going across the Atlantic, and I said, we should open the rudder up. No, 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 everybody said, this is Nicolson, as usual, going over the top. So I dug my heels in, and the rudder was dropped, and we split it open. The two sides of the fiberglass rudder were not filled solid. There was odd different kinds of plastic squished in, and then quite a lot of the interior was made up of wooden battens. Now the shipwright who had done the application of the wooden battens had had a titanic row with his woman that night previously, obviously. He was in a very bad temper. Instead of cutting the battens to length, he took pieces of wood and broke them over his knee, so that this wood had sharp edges at both ends, just waiting. I don't know whether you've read any of my books about wood surveying, but where you see a fracture, that's where the water lodges, and then the rot spores go, and that's where you get rot. So I would suggest, if you are surveying a boat that's going across the Atlantic, it's not a bad idea to drop the rudder. The chain plates are very often attached to plywood bulkheads, and you get water through the deck, runs down to the bolts and the chain plates, and you get rot there. And of course, the famous ones are Sigma 33s, where you can inspect the starboard side if you stick your head into the pilot berth, but you can't see the port side. And it requires some dismantling. And of course, everybody digs the heels and says, oh, no, no, not necessary. And it's not a bad idea to say to them, well, okay, that's fine, but don't forget to tell your insurance company that the port side chain plate has never been checked and that there's a fair chance that there's rot there. And of course, what happens is that the bolts in the plywood bulkhead tear out and go zipping up in the air, and they have a hole, you then have a hole in the deck. And of course, this only happens in bad weather. And I have a very good friend, this happened to him, and I had warned him, and we did settle that I was right, and it cost him a double Lafroig egg, which was very nice. The trouble with leaving anything to chance, in my experience, is that sooner or later, that owner for whom you've done a survey is going to be the idiot who doesn't reef when he should, goes crashing down the Irish Sea, pulls out a chain plate, and then has a rather violent pumping problem. The seacocks, there was an absolute rash about 40 years ago of seacocks letting go. And at one time, the number of yacht losses was mainly through defective seacocks. And some of them were really good fun. One of them was in the Kinnan Canal, so the boat sank in the canal and that blocked the canal. And of course, if it happens at sea and you don't have little woody plugs to put in, then it could be, well, I was going to say coffins, but of course there aren't any coffins in the Middle Atlantic. The plastic seacocks have been a very mixed blessing. I built a 41-footer because I had a 4-year-old daughter who didn't like boats that heeled, and it seemed only right to do something about it, and she was a gorgeous little girl. And when she said, Daddy, Daddy, this boat is fun, but it heels, I don't like it. So I just set about and built a 41-footer for her. And we put plastic seacocks in. And when we launched, my eldest son was with me, and he or I trod on the plastic seacock and it broke in half and the boat started to sink as we launched it. And he, being a real seaman, grabbed a broom handle and sharpened it and shoved it in the hole. You don't see many plastic seacocks, and the theory is that they are now made so that you don't break them when you tread on them. But do the seacocks know about it? The mast pillar is, in my experience, one of the really scary pieces of structure. I had a survey in, I think it was Virgin Gorda in the Caribbean, and I was walking through the restaurant of the marina, and there were three characters knocking back the rums as if they owned the distillery, and they were a pale shade of white. And I had to get to the bottom of the story, and it was really very simple. They were a delivery crew. They'd picked up the boat in Brittany and sailed across the Atlantic. And on the whole, the weather was quite good until they had almost got to the destination. And then there was some quite severe weather. And one of them went down into the cabin, and the top of the mast pillar had 3 holes drilled in it to take the electric cables, which came down the mast and through the cabin top. The electric cables went down the tube and out to the bottom. The 3 holes had joined up with a crack, and then the crack had started to go on round and round and round until the whole of the top of the metal mast tube was fractured right through, whereupon the mast, the upstanding part of the mast tube started to march slowly but relentlessly aft. And when they discovered it, the circle of the mast tube was halfway back on the circle of the intact piece at the very top. God bless you. I shall need one of those. Would you like to pass me some water, would you please? So I thought nothing more of it, except that don't buy cheap boats. And when you do, make sure that they have no holes drilled in the mast tube. And then I was asked to survey an ex-charter boat in Largs, and the owner lived in Portsmouth and didn't want to waste money coming up. He said, select the best of this ex-charter fleet and survey it, and then I will buy it and I'll come up and sail it south, just like that. And I think the first 3 of these boats had fractures, not right round, just that the holes had joined up, cracks across. And so I'm rather suspicious. There is, as you can see, a deliberate mistake. You may not be able to see it at the back, but people in the front will see the mast pillar, as drawn, is not in the middle of the mast, which is another rather scary thing. And that is occasionally, the reason for that may be that if the boat has weather helm and the mast has been moved forward a fraction and the pillar's not being moved, then you may get that particular trouble. P brackets, again, Sigma 33 standard trouble. I'd be very interested, does everybody here describe the cure required when you list a defect? Do you say, we've got a cracked mast pillar or whatever, and this is how it's to be repaired, or do you just list it?
Further investigation.
Yes. There's a famous Scottish surveyor who retired about 30 years ago, who never, under any circumstances, suggested how the repair should be done. And I thought he wasn't really giving value for money. And I'm very conscious of the fact that you and I are not like a supermarket. You go to a supermarket, you buy a trolley full of food, and you go home and get drunk with the wine and whiskey, and you've got food. You've bought something tangible. What we're doing is selling a sheaf of paper. You can't eat, well, you could eat it, I suppose, but you wouldn't normally eat it. And we have a problem relating to what we are handing over in exchange for £500, £600, £700. I mean, I've just sent in a bill for just under £1,000, and I'm sure plenty of you do that often enough. It's quite a lot of money for somebody with 5 kids and a wife who wants a new dress every week. I try to compensate this disparity by giving the boat buyer, if it's a purchase survey, a little bit more than he might reasonably expect. And one of the things we do is to say, okay, when you've got the report, First of all, get stiff whiskey, read it because it's nothing but defects. And when you've read it through twice, and we always emphasize twice, then phone me up. And I always say, I don't mind 4 telephone calls, but I want a bottle of Lafroig for the 5th. The appreciation that gets is quite extraordinary. Buyers do not, on the whole, know a hell of a lot about boats. They think they do, and they all read the Yachting Monthly and Practical Boat Owner, but there is a hell of a lot of ignorance out there. And I think letting people talk to you on the phone, but you have to be damn careful what you say. They may be recording it. But I do think saying, phone me up 4 times if you want. Undercut me if you want. Tell them you can phone you 6 times. I got caught once. We surveyed a Sigma 33, and we'd had one for 19 years, so we thought we knew a bit about Sigma 33s. And the chap was going from dinghies, and he was an international winner, not quite Olympic level, but he built dinghies, and he knew a hell of a lot about dinghies. And I think he phoned me up 16 times, and not just 5 minutes. I mean, these were my wife moaning from the bed, when are you coming back to bed? But I still think it's a very good idea to let people phone you. As far as P brackets are concerned, certainly with Sigma 33s, the trick is you cut a trench upwards right round the blade where it goes into the hull, and you run, then you etch prime the metal, then you run 2 complete circuits of the non-hardening Sikaflex, and you push it well in, and then to keep the Sikaflex in, you re-fiberglass on the outside, 300 millimeters onto the hull, and at least halfway down onto the stem of the P bracket. And that and you go for 12 millimeters thick at the root. And that works well with a Sigma 33, and I would think would work pretty well with that kind of boat generally.
Did you specify that in your report?
When we do Sigma 33s, we do, and for some extraordinary reason, we don't do it with other things. I think the trouble about doing a lot of surveys is that there's what the services call mission creep, only it's mission creep backwards. You tend to get shorthand and so on. I like to think that the owner or the buyer feels he's got his money's worth. If anybody complains, and it doesn't happen very often, I say, when did you last get a bill from a lawyer? How many hours did he work for you? Did he give you a firm opinion? And what was his bill? And that always shuts them up. Because the trouble with this industry is that we don't have whatever the legal organization is, but we really suffer from a bad income. And I mean, there should be a row of Lamborghinis outside, not an old Avensis like mine. Right, next picture. No, I'm fine with water, thanks. Don't let me stop you. These are things which I write down before I go to the boat, because I always find that there's a shortage of time, and if I can just tick each one off, that's fine. It's very difficult to tell whether the mast has been down recently, but if the boat has general neglect, or even moderate neglect, you can be damn sure the mast hasn't been down unless the boat's been undercover in the winter. And certainly in Scotland, the majority of boats are not undercover. I usually make a great song and dance about the fact that the mast hasn't been down in the hope that they'll send me back a second time to the marina to look at the mast when it is down. Wear on goosenecks, that is a thing we learnt with our Sigma 33. We had it for 19 years, and I think we went through 3 pivot plates. They're made of toilet paper. They wear very fast. What tends to happen is that the boat gets laid up, the mast gets taken down, the boom gets taken off, and then the mast gets taken down. And when the marina staff put the boom back on, because they're marina staff and they don't care a damn and their hobby is golf, they do not put the washers back. So you've got the pivot plate wearing on the bottom lug of the mast fitting. And if you've got a very stiff vang, one of these gas vangs, it may be pushing the boom up. So sometimes you get both the aft facing lugs on the mast fitting at the gooseneck, both worn. Flares out of date. I don't know what the percentage is, but I reckon it must be of the order of 90% of the boats we see have flares out of date. And there's a lot of chat about they aren't very much used and so on. I think it's quite a good idea to have flares. My youngest son was in course 10 or 11 off Dublin, and he was in deep trouble. It was a delivery job and the boat shouldn't have been at sea. He let off flares, and at least they went off. In fact, the flares he let off were red rockets. He let the rockets off first. The interesting thing was that it was blowing so hard, the rockets just went horizontal along the sea surface, and the flares did bring the lifeboat out. The keel bolt checks, again, I don't know what the percentage is. We nearly always tell people that if the keel bolts have not been seen in the last 3 years, then we reckon three should be taken out. When I had the Sigma 33, worried that we had some pretty wild characters who were the other owners. Of course, I wasn't wild. And so I was worried that one of us would lose a keel and our insurance premium multiplied by 10. And so we had an association. I organized the purchase of a socket spanner to fit the keel bolt nuts and a tube to extend onto the handle and so on. And that worked very well, but that was many years ago. And my experience is very few yachts ever have the keel bolts out. And the price of yachts has not gone up commensurate with inflation. You and I know that new boats are in fact too cheap. How do they save money? Well, one way they save is by thinning down the scantlings. But I'll bet you they're buying their keel bolts from China. And I've had fascinating experience with rigging from China and Russia. We were pioneers in the use of titanium shackles. And when the first batch arrived from Russia, the hole for the pin was not central by any means, so that the circle where the pin went through was very thin on one side and fat on the other. So we couldn't use those shackles. Hand bilge pumps.
Sorry, before you move on, when you've had two bolts removed or given check bolts, how often do you find the problem? Because in order,
No, but you've only got to find it one. As I keep saying, doctors kill off people one at a time. You and I kill off a whole crew when we make a mistake. So it's a good idea to take them out. And a lot of maintenance is just maintenance. You know, there's a tiny bit of rust on a galvanized hose clamp, so you condemn it. But the reason you condemn it is because it's got rust, and rust does not cure itself. Rust, the rate of deterioration increases, and then the exhaust pipe comes off and everybody gets gassed. Well, not everybody.
With the keel bolts, if they're cast and they'll be cast with a J or an L on board.
Yeah, well, you've got problems. You do have problems. I know, yeah. But if they go across the Atlantic, then that's you dig your heels in and you say, and of course now, I mean, that boat going down, those chaps have done us all. I'm sorry they had to get onto the boat, but they have made people realize it's a good idea to have a boat which sticks with its keel. These days, I keep rabbiting on about how modern equipment is shoddy. I surveyed a couple of weeks ago a 50-footer. She had the latest whale bilge pump. To save money, they don't have a handle. The cover is the handle. It's a very bad idea. It doesn't work. The leverage is minute. You've met them. Exactly. In this case, the handle, which was the cover, had come away from the diaphragm. And I was so intrigued with this, I wasted at least 10 minutes working out how you could mend it, and came to the conclusion that, in fact, to do a proper repair, A, it probably wouldn't work, and B, it was certainly going to be cheaper to buy another pump. That is, to my mind, that is a sad reflection on the way our job is being made more difficult, because a lot of modern stuff is rubbish as compared with what it was certainly 20 years ago. And I mustn't get on about my apprenticeship, but when we, for instance, designed yachts, we designed all the mast fittings, and we didn't even put lightning holes on. And there's boats going around, which I built in my apprenticeship 75 years ago. They're still going around. They've still got the original goosenecks on. Munster Sims, who make whale pumps, used at one time to cast the bodies of the pumps in aluminium. If you come across one of those, insist that it's opened up, because a puddle of seawater lodges inside the belly of the pump, and the aluminium corrodes. And being aluminium, it doesn't just throw off a nice thin layer of rust like steel. It goes berserk, and it generates white crystal, which gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually the pump won't work. There is a very nice Nicolson trick. I, being a hard-up surveyor, when I open up my whale plastic pump and find that a piece of wood is lodged under one of the flap valves, I then find that the flap valve has bent up, and I unfasten it, turn it 180 degrees and fit it down again. So I haven't had to buy a new flap valve, and I've saved myself at least £1. But flap valves inside whale pumps are surprisingly prone to A, being blocked by a tiny piece of debris, and B, taking a permanent set open. Right, have we dealt with all that? Oh, fire extinguishers. I find it, I suppose the answer is that the majority of people, A, don't go to sea, and B, they don't have fires at sea. I've had two, and in each case, the shore was, well, in one case, the shore was quite a long way away, and in the second case, the shore was nowhere to be seen, and the owner hadn't, I was a delivery trip I doing the second case, and the owner hadn't told me until I got on board that he had a very retarded son who was about 19, built like a boxer, and not really in control. I mean, the chap had mental illness of some fair magnitude. And I was asleep in a settee, and there was a yell of fire, fire, we're on fire. And I sat up in my sleeping bag, and there was a fire extinguisher right beside me. It was a brand new boat, so I grabbed it off its handle. To my intense embarrassment, I had not read the instructions when I came on board for the delivery trip. And the instructions said, strike knob, da, 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 da. So I struck the knob. Unfortunately, the instructions were on the same side as the nozzle. So I extinguished my shirt and then turned it 180 degrees and put fire out. So maybe when you are surveying a boat, it might be quite a good idea to make sure that the instructions printed on the side of the thing are not the same size as the nozzle. And that'll just show you what bloody observant, excellent, super people we are when it comes to surveying. Sorry?
Fire extinguishers are a bit like insurance for surveyors. They shouldn't really be allowed.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true.
They do both lots of business. You're about designing the superstructure for Lioness. Helios, what's the name? Helios Lioness after she had a huge fire.
After I've had a whiskey tonight, get me on the subject of Jim McKelvey's engine room fire, which really was absolutely classic. And it's one of my better yarns. And I think the sooner we go on to the next picture, the better. I'm very interested to know who does not do any survey of the engine at all? You all do a little bit. That's interesting. I think you're sticking your neck out. I write in big letters, we have not surveyed the engine. And then I get half a page. One of the things we tend to talk about on the phone, but not put in the report, is that if the engine's 20 years old, unless the boat's been permanently owned by an engineer, we always say, look, 20-year-old engine, you really got to start saving your pounds for a new one. If the engine's 30 years old, and she has the usual defects that you can see, we say on the phone, but we don't write down, really, you're running a risk of going to sea depending on the engine. And nowadays, of course, because everybody is electronics mad, you need batteries that work, and the batteries need charging, and the engine charges the batteries. So yachts are quite incredibly vulnerable. I promised I wouldn't reminisce too much, but when I was apprentice, we used to build 40-foot and 48-foot yachts with 4 horsepower engines. And the reason for that was that boats were all kept on mooring, so there was no question of going in and out of marinas. And the engine was for flat calms, and also the engine was to recharge the batteries. Nowadays, of course, people think that the engine is for running 90% of the time, and you can beat down the Clyde on the gorgeous sailing weather, and you've got full Genoa and one reef in the main, and you're really enjoying yourself. And you look around, and half the boats going down the Clyde against the breeze are running on engine. And I blame women. They don't like being wet and cold. And why can't they realize that the whole point about going to sea is it's nice when it stops, and it's bloody most of the time when you're at sea. Where are we? So we tend, having said we've not surveyed the engine, we then actually tend to write quite a lot about it. And here are some of the things which cracks in the water pump impeller, that they're obvious. And that's what I call the octopus, the little rubber octopus that wrote in the impeller. Inaccessible oil filler caps. I think this is something we should all mention. It's a sore point with me because the current boat I have is a Maxi 1000, and you cannot refill the oil in the sump without special kit. And I enjoy inventing things for that sort of crises, but your average owner does not want to get his hands dirty, and he doesn't want that sort of trouble. And the Maxi 1000's a popular boat. I mean, I would think they built several, in fact, they built several hundred. And I just wonder about all the other, the oil into the engine sump. Sorry? Sorry? The marina, yes, the marina does it, yes. That's right, I think that's true. But if your engine starts using oil and you need it, and you're halfway down the Irish Sea, you really got problems. One thing about oil filters and fuel filters is, in my experience, they do not rust until they're more than 18 months old. So if I see rust, I very often get told, oh, the engine's been serviced. And then you go on board and you find rust on the replaceable filters. And quite obviously, the engine has not been properly serviced. It's a great giveaway because I don't know who makes, well, I do. Fram makes some of the best filters, and they are well painted, and they don't rust until they're a year and a half old. Twin clamps on the flexible, old-fashioned stern glands, I think, are a very good idea. I've met a lot of people who have been involved in a vessel about to sink because water's been racing up the stern tube, and it's pretty frightening one way and another. I reckon that at least once a year, I survey a boat with an old-fashioned tightening gland, and there's ordinary nuts on the tightening bolts and no locking nuts. Now, I'm tempted to go off on another of my locks. I'm sure you know you should never use an eye lock twice. In other words, you put it on and leave it on. If you take it off, you must throw it away and get another one. So I like locking nuts on top of nuts. If you don't have locking nuts, you can, if the engine's vibrating, get one or both of the nuts to come off, and then the glass opens and the boat sinks, unless you can get the whole thing put together again. And if you go up the Sound of Mull, on one of the sets of islands, either the Grey Isles or the Green Isles, there's the wreck of a puffer, and that's why she sank. Nuts off the stern gland. How pathetic is that? Total ship loss for the sake of two, what would they, 25mm nuts. Pathetic. Engine mounts. I'm astonished the number of people who never ever replace the engine mounts. So they're made of some sort of flexi material, probably not rubber, but it certainly doesn't last. And if the engine's vibrating, your trouble could be engine mounts that are flattened and so on. We have come across, in fact, we had a rash, I don't know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, of fractured engine feet. I suppose they were using Chinese steel, and maybe they were all Volvos. And it was really a very profitable business because people complained that the engine was doing things. And I went down and looked at it, and fractured foot, problem solved in half an hour. Large-ish fee, very nice. Pity it doesn't happen still. The engine bearers, when I was apprenticed, I think we had a rule that the engine bearers should be 1 3/4 times the length of the engine plus the gearbox. Well, of course, none of them ever anywhere like that nowadays. But the sharp interior angle between the back or the front of the engine bearer should not be as drawn. It should taper out. And this is just basic engineering. And you get cracks on the hull. Interesting enough, the cracks seem, in my experience, to be more often on the forward end of the engine bearers than the aft end. That may be because of the difficulty of seeing the aft end. I don't know. Having said that, most of us seem to spend most of our time saying that the mast was standing and so on. The mast is, after all, the engine of a sailing boat, and they really rather matter. And I make a case for putting information about the mast above your head on the basis that you haven't seen it, you can't get close, whatever wording you want, and then putting in information you can. Drooping cross trees are really quite frightening, and if you don't understand why, I suggest you get a good book on bridge design or basic engineering. Interestingly enough, the theory says that the outer tip of the cross and the wire above it should be at an, and the should also be X, but it's never ever that way. The angle at the top is always smaller than the angle at the bottom. And the reason partly is the way the sockets are made, because the sockets never have enough tilt. On the whole, masts don't fall down too often. If you've got binoculars with you, you could look up the mast at the mast fittings, and if you see corrosion or missing fittings, missing fastenings, and you mention them, then with a little bit of luck, you can coax the buyer to take the mast down. Then you can go back and do the second part of the survey and get that extra bit more, extra bit of fee. Where the cross tree end, in my experience, that's quite rare, but it's a bit scary when you see it. The essence of most cross trees is they're tubular, and you do not want, from an engineering point of view, you do not want a dent or any indent of wear on a tube, because the loss of strength is very serious and very rapid. And so any sort of damage there is really rather critical. And cross tree is cheap. Coming down, no split pin on a clevis pin. I was surveying in the marina down there a few years ago, and it was in the old days when a lot of waves got into the marina and the boat was pitching a bit. And I was on the foredeck, and the clevis pin at the bottom of the forestay had no split pin. And for once, there was no split pins in my overall pockets, which was sad omission. And I thought, this mast could come down on my head. Good idea to get out of the way for a start. And I ran to the office and said, here is a situation which needs curing now. And I couldn't get, it was a few years ago, not the present management. I couldn't persuade anybody to take an interest until I said, when the mast comes down, it could crash across the decks, not only of the adjacent yacht, but the one beyond that too. You would then have 3 damaged yachts, and your insurance company may be very unhappy about this. And it was amazing how quickly a split pin appeared and was put in. The trouble with split pins is they are so small, and some of them fatigue, and I reckon we find a missing split pin certainly every 5 or 6 years. And of course, if the clevis pin comes out, then you get all kinds of drama. On the bottom left, almost all yachts have T-terminals. That is, the wire comes up, swage fitting, it turns over, and it's got a T-bar. And the reason these things exist is because they are cheap to make, and they are cheap to fit, and everything these days has to be done as cheaply as possible. And this has now got to a stage where my great nephew, who's keeping up the tradition of being a naval architect, is trying to design the next lot of warships. And every turn he makes, the accountants come in and say, make it cheaper. They don't say make it better. They don't say make it a better warship. They only say make it cheaper. And you and I know that no vessel can be built down to a price. There is a minimum price which any vessel can be built. And all this constant nagging to get the price down is going to cost us not only lives, but it's going in the long course to cost us a reputation as an industrial nation.
Can I ask you something related to the split pin? A lot of these people tend to have cutter rings.
Yes, they're horrible.
Now, I've seen so many pools.
Yes, they are dangerous.
I think they're dangerous.
Yes, they are very bad indeed. Yes. On the right-hand side, there is a fork end rigging. Now, I'm a founder member of the Ocean Cruising Club, and the one thing which is pretty consistent in the Ocean Cruising Club is that people will not go to sea with T-ends. And there have been so many offshore, dismasted. What was the trouble? It may pull out of the mast. It's more likely to be where it bends over and you've got the T-end, cracks there. And if you're doing a survey of a mast that's horizontal, it's surprisingly difficult in some of them to inspect right in there. And I've taken to taking the damn thing right out, which is a bit of a bore. You've got to struggle with the rigging. Maybe I'm getting middle-aged. Right. Anything else? No, let's go to the next one, shall we? There was a lot of chat this morning about being sued and so on. And I've spent quite a lot of time as a professional witness on various legal cases. If you really want an enjoyable legal case, look up the Delphine case, not just because the judge said something nice about my professional witness work, But the Delphine case was a 90-foot wooden boat. And again, only one Lafroig, and I will tell you the Delphine case, which was totally fascinating. Right. The thing about us being sued is that it's a very nasty experience. I've been professional witness. Some very good surveyors who got caught one way and another. And here are what I would call the sources of reaction. Obviously, if you got a letter from a lawyer saying, we're suing you, your professional indemnity broker in his conditions or her conditions says, the first thing you do is contact the insurance broker or the underwriter. Well, actually, no. The first thing you do, I suggest you phone me, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But there are these various sources of help, not just for when you're sued, but for if you've got a problem. You're looking at something, what the hell's that? You don't know. So you get in touch, obviously, with the IIMS. Possibly the Royal Institute of Naval Architecture. I've been a member since 1945. I was writing a book called Small Steel Craft, and I wrote to them, as you did in those days, before emails and other modern stuff, and said, please would they send me a batch of books, as you could do in those days, about small steel crafts, as I'm doing a book and I didn't want to miss anything out. And back came the reply, our library is not catalogued. That is scandalous. This organization's been going since 1840 something. How can you possibly claim to be a royal institute with an... So maybe they'll help. I don't suppose anybody else is a member. Are they any good?
They might be in an academic sense.
Yeah.
You know, I can't afford to go to conferences.
Yeah.
And yeah, I did go to one in London on CTDs and alternative power CTDs. It was at their headquarters, and there was myself and somebody from BMT, only commercial people at the conference, everybody else was university.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not really representing the industry.
No. Right. Now, on the left, books and magazines. I know I'm calling my own tune. I know I've had a magazine column running since 1953. It's changed magazines twice. I think it's a good, for instance, Practical Boat Owner, it's rubbish page after page, and suddenly there's an absolute jewel. And I think, God, yes, how useful. But that's how you mend these things and so on. I have a lot of time for that magazine. It's written with a lot of amateur rubbish, but let's face it, if you're digging for diamonds, you dig up 1,000 tons of rubbish for one little tiny diamond. As far as books are concerned, I've written 28. I'd get damn all money. Actually, I've had 5 publishers, and I'm bound to say the IIMS is definitely the second best publisher to date. And the way things are going, they will soon be my best publisher. Because you get other people's experience, and I've already explained about how one chapter of one book, I got all that experience by going to other people's books. The internet, God, how I hate it, because I'm with BT, and BT are clearly determined to sabotage my life and my work and so on. And what I think we should do, all get together, and we should sell BT cells short and do it week after week and get them into, I won't go on. A special mate. Now this, I was incredibly lucky. Our office, the main bon mot is, it's good to be good, it's better to be lucky. I was apprentice to Fred Parker, who'd been a Lloyd's surveyor. He took me on straight from school, green as grass I was. And because he ran the Dorset Yacht Company, employed about 60 people, making small warships and torpedo boats and things like that. But he was designing yachts right through the war, and he kept winning design competitions in the Yachting World, Yachting Monthly. And we actually started building yachts way before the war finished, because we were not getting so many Admiralty contacts, and we wanted to hit the ground running when the peace came. And he ran the yard and had to do design work in the evenings and the weekends, and it was killing him, literally. And so he needed somebody who would do as he was told, and in those days I did as I was told. I've become a pirate since then, but I did as I was told, and we designed yachts. Took about 600-700 hours to do a yacht design in those days. And we did all the stability calculations using slide rules. I said I wouldn't reminisce, sorry about that. What then happened, I won't tell you my whole life story, but I came back from Canada, built myself a little boat and sailed home, which was a great way to learn surveying. My God, you get yourself in the middle Atlantic, it's blowing force 10, you've just been chucked out of your bunk. You know quite a lot of surveying in a very few minutes. Small windows, tight hatches, and so on. And then I worked for Alan Buchanan, who was at the peak of his career. And we also had Oliver Lee. So there was Alan, Oliver Lee, and myself. And it was great because, of course, we had problems, but there were 3 of us. And Alan's wife actually was a very good seawoman. So in fact, there were 4 of us. No, there were 5 of us, because the secretary was married to a chief petty officer shipwright in the Navy, gorgeous blonde, very distracting. And so there were 5 of us. So any problem, we solved it. And then I came up here, and Alfred Milne asked me to be a business partner. And he did all the design work, and I did all the survey work. And I would go out up to Thurso, or, well, I had one job in Australia, that was nice. All the way to Australia for 1 yacht. Lovely, lovely job. Pays to write books sometimes. Anyway, Alfred and I were 10 years apart. He was 10 years older. And our backgrounds are completely different. And I would come in on a Tuesday morning, having surveyed all on Monday, and I'd do a little sketch. What in hell is that? And he'd say, yes. He ran a boatyard, Butte Slip Dock. We had that in the boatyard 10 years ago and so on. What I'm saying is you need a mate, and you need somebody. Ideally, you meet them every month, go to a pub and get drunk together or have a meal together. A mate is a very good idea. And if the mate is a specialist in electronics and you're a specialist in engines and so on, that's doubly good. I think that what I miss most about the current situation, as far as I'm concerned, is that IIMS should be based in Scotland. We all know that's absolute nonsense having it in Portsmouth. I miss the personal contact. I'm the old-fashioned person. I write letters, for heaven's sake. I'm keeping the GPO single-handed going. I think being able to talk to a mate is extremely valuable, apart from the pleasure of it and, you know, swapping names. That was the other thing. At one stage, Alfred Milne and I kept a list of impossible owners for whom we would not work. Or they were graded. Some we would work, but we doubled the fees. 1 or 2, we trebled the fees. But some we would not work for at all. And I commend this idea to you. Before you leave, take somebody's name and email and so on, and meet them at least 6 times a year. It's a great trick. Okay, now, as a last resort, if you get sued, don't phone the broker or the underwriter first, phone me. Why? Let me turn to my notes. Because I've been a professional witness so often, and I have come up with a procedure which I strongly recommend. This isn't going to guarantee you we're going to win the case. This is going to improve your chances by a hell of a lot. Item 1, make sure that the lawyer on your side knows a lot about boats. I've actually been in a case where there was big partnership, and we got a lawyer, and we started talking boats, and we said, do you sail? No. You don't? No, I think we said, do you race? No. Do you sail? No. Out you go. And we found a partner who sailed, and we started to win that case from that moment. Item number 2, make sure that the lawyer inspects the boat in question. Now that's very important. I had a lovely, lovely case of 1-tonners. We fought it in Dublin, and the lawyer on the other side knew nothing about boats. He didn't know what a 1-tonner was, and that was the essence of the case. Anybody, let me quickly explain. A 1-tonner is a particular kind of racing boat, and it has to fit a formula called the 1-ton formula. Okay, this chap knew nothing about boats, and he knew nothing about 1-tonners. Our lawyer raced 1-tonners. Our lawyer was shown around the defective boat. I won't, maybe tonight, an extra Lachfeuer will get me going on this case because it's totally fascinating. We won hands down because our lawyer ran rings round the other one, because he knew about sailing and he knew about 1-tonners and he looked at the boat. Right, item 3. Make sure that the lawyer's not a sole trader, because otherwise it may get run over or elope or something, and you suddenly have taken all the trouble to get the right lawyer, taken them to the boat, pumped them full of information, and then they're not to hand. Actually, you're pretty safe these days. Most law firms have at least 5 people, but the trouble is, the reason for that is they have specialists. One is doing divorce, one is doing conveyancing, one is doing criminal work, and so on. The best lawyer we ever had a law court right opposite the central courts in London. So when they had a case, they just walked across the road into the court. And the senior lawyer was a client of mine, and we rebuilt his boat. And that was wildly successful. Just pray you get that level. When you come to court, you must have firepower, which is facts, which are indisputable, photographs and so on. But the people who fire off the artillery are the professional witnesses, as well, of course, as your legal profession. You want a professional witness who doesn't have to be as old as me. There aren't any as old as me. But you want to be somebody well out of their 30s, and they want to be experienced, and ideally they want to have been in court as a witness several times. And if the other side bring 2 professional witnesses, you bring 2 or 3 and stuff it down the insurance company's throat. The other side have got 2, we must have 2. If they say it's expensive, quote their profit figures for them in the last year. You do want to know a lot about your insurance company. Okay, next item. It's not enough to have 2 professional witnesses or 3. You've got to spend a lot of time together and not just chatting about which pretty girl you fancy. You've got to work on the case solidly. And looking back, I seem to have spent God knows how many evenings and weekends whenever I've been a professional witness. It's very, well, it was in the case when I was regular. It was very time consuming, very demanding. And in the Delphine case, I would fly down to London on the Monday, work there for the rest of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday morning, fly back on Thursday, work all through Friday, quite a lot of Saturday. Boat got neglected, it was horrible. Part of Sunday, and then fly down again the next week. And this went on 6 weeks. Mind you, the fees, wow, fantastic. Being a professional is when it works is good. But you want to make damn sure that whoever is paying your fees is going to, because in the old days, if you won a case, you got the other side's expenses, but you don't, the other side paid your expenses, but that doesn't happen anymore. one of the things you have to, what you need in all these cases is ammunition, and photographs are ammunition, and books are ammunition. One of the great things about having 28 books is that when I turn up in court, I'm arriving with a wodge of technical books, and my QC or whatever says, and Mr. Nicholson says in chapter 1, whatever, very, very useful indeed. And if you get sued, or if you're a legal case, phone me up and I'll do my best to tell you which book to look in. And you have to buy the book. Wouldn't that be nice? No, you don't. Your legal team have to buy the book. I once had a survey in a legal case in New York, which was in the thing called, there were two identical towers, and we were halfway up one of them. And something rather drastic happened to these two towers. I was glad I'd got out by that time. But we won that case partly because our legal team were flourishing books. And the IT is a load of rubbish, but what's written in books must be true. It's in the book. Well, I know I'm calling my own thing. Make sure if your photographs must be dated. Many years ago, there was a lovely case against a very well-known Clyde surveyor who lives a little bit north of here and is retired, twice married, far be it for me to say who he was. And he turned up in court with 4 photographs, and I was in the witness box, and I was handed them, and their lawyer said, "Mr. Nicholson, what do you think of this photograph?" And I looked at it, and I turned it 90 degrees, and I turned it 180 degrees, and I turned it 270 degrees. And then I said, "Which way up is it?" And the entire court burst in laughing. And we started to win the case from that moment. So make sure that your photographs are not only dated and ideally timed, but you want to have a scale, meter scale or foot scale, on the photograph so that everyone can see the scale. What I'm saying is you win these cases by doing a hell of a lot of work, weekend work and so on, and all working together. And I've helped to win totally unwinnable cases. The one that keeps coming to mind is International Paints against performance yachts. Now, International Paints make not just paints, but they make goo for joining the deck onto the hull of racing dinghies. Performance yachts built lasers. International Paints produced drums of this goo. I suppose it was some sort of polyester resin or some sort of chemical. And they shipped the drums to Performance Yachts, who proceeded to use the material to bond the decks onto the hulls. 10 days after the dispatch, International Paints laboratory phoned through to the production manager and said, "The last lot of gunge is defective. Don't send it out, don't use it." But it had gone out 10 days beforehand, and Performance Yachts had built a lot of dinghies. I think in the end, we were up for the replacement of 430 dinghies because these people were churning them out. They had lots of sales all over the world. They had a factory in America for Americans, but we were sending them all over Europe, literally all over Europe. I mean, behind the Iron Curtain. And we had, as I say, 430 known defective yachts. And that was very high profile. Everybody knew lasers, everybody knew International Paints. And there was a really horrible German silver medal winner who took his brand new laser out into the North Sea, and it was blowing quite hard. And the boat behaved like an alligator. The deck came off the hull, and the hull went off down to the bottom of the sea. And the very fat, outrageously Germanic Olympic winner got swept off, and everybody laughed, except him. So there was a lot of publicity, and we were going to not just lose this case, it was going to cost a fortune. By great good fortune, the QC on our side was related to somebody who was at school with me. So after we spent all day chatting, we went and had a drink together. And I couldn't understand how he was behaving. And I didn't like to say, look, why do you keep dragging this on? Because the longer it goes on, the higher our expenses are, and we'll have to pay them. And the higher the other side expenses are, and we'll have to pay those as well, as you did in those days. And he said, oh, I know what I'm doing. And eventually I realized that, then he said, I'm just studying this other firm. And he was pre-internet days, but you could find out what was going on. In another court, this firm, Performance Boats, was being quietly ground down. They were running out of money. And RQC won the case by dragging it on until the other side went bankrupt. So unwinnable cases are winnable. I've gone on far too long.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Any questions?